God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing and acceptable to you, our rock and our Redeemer. Lord, do not let us leave here today lest we leave having encountered the living God in your living word. As we pray in your name, amen. In the year 40 Common Era, the Roman Emperor Caligula had a statue made. A statue made that was going to travel, according to his plan, from Rome itself all the way to Jerusalem, where it would be installed in the temple in Jerusalem. Not just in any specific or any random place within the temple. Instead, this statue of the emperor, this statue of Caligula, was to be installed in the center of the Holy of Holies. In the place where only God was said to reside, where only the holiest of priests were allowed to go and to minister. There, Caligula would place his statue, reminding the Roman Empire in Jerusalem and in the surrounding areas that Caesar is Lord, that Caesar is the Son of God. The statue was to be sent from Rome to Ptolemais, where it would be picked up by Petronius, the governor of Syria at the time. Petronius picked it up in Ptolemais while being accompanied by 2 legions of Roman soldiers, about 10,000 Roman soldiers, to serve as an honor guard for both Governor Petronius and for the statue of Caesar. As they left Ptolemais, they were met with resistance. Thousands of Jews gathered outside the city, halting Petronius' progress. The Jews gathered around and before the 2 legions of Roman soldiers. But they didn't hurl insults. They didn't throw stones. They didn't brandish weapons. Instead, they knelt on the ground and presented to the soldiers the backs of their necks as a way of saying, we would rather die than see this statue installed in God's place. Well, Petronius had 10,000 soldiers with him, and he was not fazed. So Petronius just went around the Jews. Traveled from Ptolemais to Tiberias. In Tiberias, still about 100 miles from Jerusalem, Petronius was met with yet a larger contingent of Jews. Thousands and thousands coming to beg him not to place this statue in the temple. Not to desecrate God's holy house. Again, these thousands and thousands of Jews did not attack, did not act in any aggression whatsoever. Instead, they knelt down for 40 days, presenting the backs of their necks, ready to die in mass if it meant there being even a chance that this statue would not make it all the way to Jerusalem. Well, Petronius didn't exactly want to commit genocide. So he halted his progress and decided to write to Caesar to find out what he was supposed to do. Luckily for him, and quite honestly probably for the Jews gathered there as well, the letter never made it to Caligula. You see, before it could get there, the Praetorian Guard had Caligula assassinated and someone else stepped into the role of Caesar. The statue never made it to Jerusalem. In fact, we don't actually know what happened to this statue. Petronius got to go back to his governorship, and the Jews went back to their homes. They were willing to die, though, before they saw God's place, the Holy of Holies, desecrated by a state symbol being installed where only God belonged. Why? Wouldn't it have been easier just to adapt to a new reality? I mean, that's what humanity is good at, right? We either adapt to what's going on around us, or we find ways to adapt our surroundings so that we're able to survive. That's why we've been able to grow and become the society and the culture around the globe that we are today. Couldn't they have just allowed the statue to be installed, dealt with it, this new reality? And after a while, I'm sure months or years later, it would have felt like it would have been as if it was always there. Why are they willing to die to see this not happen? I think maybe it's because they know their history. They know their scripture well enough to remember what happens in the time of the kings for the people of Israel. And especially during the time of the kings when that same people has been split into two kingdoms. When God's people begin to adapt, begin to compromise, begin to worship other gods alongside their own, begin to fall away from the God who created them, who delivered them from captivity, and who covenanted to be their God throughout eternity. They adapted away from God. And because of this, their scripture attests, our scripture attests, that God brought the exile upon them. Because they adapted into a place where they had removed God from the highest place of authority, of priority, and of emphasis. Because they had compromised and allowed other gods of different sorts to be on the same level as their God. Babylon was able to come in, and they were spread and dispersed throughout the known world. It is at this point, when they are adapting, when they are compromising, when they are worshiping God alongside a bunch of other gods, that we hear Isaiah start to speak. That we hear the words that Bob so eloquently read for us earlier. As Isaiah reminds them that they're called not to give this false fast. They're called not to just pay lip service to God among other gods. But instead, they're called to give to God everything they are. Worshiping God in such a way as to care for those around them, as to place God at the highest point of authority. When Isaiah says these words, when Isaiah speaks these words of God for God's people, he's trying to reorient them on God. To remove them from that place where they had allowed adaptation and compromise to change them, to reset them on right worship and right living with their God. To remind the people of God to hold strong and hold hard to the one who created them, the one who redeemed them, the one who walks with them still. Because it is in their very DNA to do so. You see, it might be in the history of the Jewish people to allow adaptation and compromise to take place within the walls of their kingdom, but it is written into the very DNA of God's people to hold hard and to hold strong to God in the midst of whatever the world throws. And we get that very clearly toward the very beginning of our scripture. Before the Exodus has happened, before there is a king over Israel, before the sea has been parted, before the plagues have entered Egypt, we hear at the very first part of Exodus the story of two Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah. Hear their story from Exodus 1. Now a new king came into power in Egypt, one who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, "Listen, the Israelite people, they've grown larger and stronger than we are. Come now, let's be smart about this and deal with them appropriately. Otherwise, they'll continue to grow, and if war breaks out, they'll join the enemy, fight against us, and flee the land." As a result of this, the Egyptians placed taskmasters over forced work gangs of Israelites and forced them into hard, oppressive labor. They had to build the storage cities of Pithom and Ramesses for Pharaoh. But the more that they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and grew in strength. So much so that the Egyptians began to look upon the Israelites with disgust and dread. So Egypt enslaved Israel, forced them into all sorts of hard labor, of building mortar and bricks, of doing field work, and all kinds of other cruel works. Pharaoh even called two Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, and said to them, "Now, whenever the Hebrew women are giving birth, and you look down and you see that the baby is a boy, kill it. If it's a girl, let it live." But the midwives respected God, and they disobeyed this direct order from the king of Egypt. The king of Egypt called to them and said, "Why are you doing this thing? Why are you letting the boys live?" And the midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, said to Pharaoh, "Hebrew women are different than Egyptian women. They're much stronger. They give birth before the midwives even get there." And because of this, God blessed the Hebrews. And they continued to grow and spread. And because they respected God, God gave the midwives households of their own. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I think it's extremely important the way that this story starts with the phrase, "A new king came into power in Egypt." You see, the Israelites at this moment have a choice that they have to make. And whether or not with this shift in power, this new alignment with a new king, they are going to adapt to their new reality, or they're going to push back against it. Quite honestly, even in the midst of forced and hard labor, it probably would have seemed easier for the Israelites to adapt, knowing that they could at some point get back into the good graces of Pharaoh and find themselves at least a little bit more comfortable, even if they were still second-class citizens. But the two heroes in this story, better yet, the two sheroes in this story, refuse to adapt. They hold hard to their allegiance to God. They respect God and disobey, yes, even lie to Pharaoh himself. Because of this, God continues to bless and multiply God's people. Because they respected God, according to Scripture, God even gives them their own households. It is in the very DNA of the people of God to hold hard to our God. It might be in the history of God's people to adapt and compromise and deal with the fallout of it. But long before any of that happened, written into our very DNA allegiance to God. As we continue our series on the social principles, today we encounter the political community. This section is all about how we engage with the government, both as United Methodists here in the United States and as United Methodists around the world, since we are a global church. It's about how we maintain our allegiance to God while also honoring the work that's going on around us in the world, in the political community, and through our governing bodies. Hear how it starts. While our allegiance to God takes precedence over our allegiance to any state, we acknowledge the vital function of government as a principal vehicle for the ordering of society. This section recognizes the great work that government can and should, and even, get this, sometimes does, while also recognizing that we are called to hold tight, to hold hard to our God. It talks about, in one section, the separation of church and state, which we as people within the United States hold to be very important. It says that the separation of church and state means that no organic union of the two should happen. But it does permit interaction. It does allow us and even urge us to walk alongside as the church, the governing bodies around us, that we might hold hard to our God and we might see God's will done. We might do so in a way that works in concert with those bodies that have been placed around and above us. We're called to honor the state without adapting our focus and right worship away from God. And we're called to make sure that we're not, even today, engaging in false fasts, paying lip service to God while also worshiping other gods, as Isaiah speaks of. For unfortunately, it does still happen too often in our world and in the church around the world. We find ourselves adapting and compromising in our convictions. Honestly, because adaptation is easy and it's what we do. My brothers and sisters, adapting might be in our history. Allegiance is in our DNA. May we hold hard to our God. May we remember that God is worth all that we have to give of our worship, of our emphasis, of our priorities, of our focus, and of our loyalty. God is worth everything, for God has given everything to us. May we be like Shiphrah and Puah. May we hold hard